of those we film? How can we be more thoughtful, more equitable, perhaps more ethical, when we're navigating the differing interests and the differing levels of power between those who are filming and those who are being filmed? Now, the question of ethics is obviously not new to documentary, it's not new to journalism, it's not new to applied research and anthropology and other fields in which we seek out individuals and ask them about their lives. But the context of the questions for us as documentary filmmakers and those in the wider industry is radically different. We are, of course, at a time in which this format has never had such a big audience, such a big reach, that there are perhaps unicorns, but nonetheless blockbuster documentaries which make millions of dollars off largely telling the stories of those who are in the films. And I guess most importantly, we've now had enough time and experience to see what happens when we don't navigate these questions well. And we're going to hear in this discussion today from two people who have had their lives documented about what that can look like and how that can feel and how we can do things differently. And essentially we're at this moment in which documentary has arrived to being an industry. And an industry without ethics is an industry without integrity. So we're going to try to explore questions like whether, when, and in what conditions should subjects be compensated, what it means to give full, free, and informed consent. Is it just a signature on a release form or something more? When might it be right or wrong to share editorial control with those in the film, or to demand when they sign away their life rights? But the lofty hope is that these four people here will not just allow us to surface these issues, but to start to give us perhaps some ideas about how we can address them, to start to think about some of the practical, legal kind of considerations, ethical frameworks for how we might navigate those in practice too. And so with that, let's start to dig in. And this is a session about agency and autonomy. It seems only appropriate that the participants of this panel introduce themselves. However, as is also about respect and balancing different interests, we will do so in 2 sentences only, please, to allow there to be lots of time. So I'll just continue on down, starting with you, Margie. And tell us why you're excited to be here.
Hi, I'm Margie Ratliff. I'm excited to be here because any conversation about ethics in documentary filmmaking is much needed and very welcomed. So I am a co-producer and participant in the documentary Subject. We premiered at Tribeca this year. It's wonderful. And I also am a former participant of a documentary on Netflix and HBO Max called The Staircase.
Thanks. Toast. Hey, I'm Mustafa, Zeno. I am a filmmaker based here in LA. I'm here because my entrance into nonfiction was in a documentary in which that was about my family coming from Syria, where I was both a co-producer and also a subject at the same time, so kind of on both sides of the filmmaking wall. I'm here to share, I guess, a little bit more about that.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Teixeira, and I'm one of the co-directors of Subject.
Hi, I'm Aaron Sloss. I run sales at Cinetic Media. I'm here because I want to help create a more sustainable documentary industry. I think we're all sort of invested in that in this room, and I think this is one of very few paths to making that possible.
Thanks, everybody. And as is convention, as moderator, I will introduce myself too. I should have done that earlier. My name is Amelia Evans. I'm excited to be here because on one hand, I'm a human rights lawyer. I focus very much on the questions of power imbalances between those whose rights are wronged and those who have the power and are able to violate rights along the way. On the other hand, because I'm a filmmaker, or perhaps more accurately, I've been working on one film for 10 years. And that film is about people who identify as being attracted to children, but who have never acted on that attraction. And the question of why they are taking this massive risk in participating in the film is, for me, a key theme. And of course, the film for me then begins with them signing their release forms. And so that we're now having this conversation and thinking about that as a process is absolutely wonderful, and I thank IDA for facilitating that. All right, let us start by learning about those lived experiences of the two that we have up here who have been in films. And so I will just pass over to perhaps you first, Margie, to talk us through in just a few minutes what the experience was like for you.
So originally a French documentary film crew came to my family in 2001, and they ended up filming, it was supposed to be a short, I think it was for HBO. It was supposed to be, a 2-hour special that turned into 20 years of a long process. So we, originally it ended up on the Sundance Channel, and then Netflix, everything changed about 5 years ago at this point, when Netflix bought the original 8 episodes, and then the two extra ones, and then the new 3 ones. And that's when my family and I knew that it would become a problem for us. This was all traumatic things that had happened in our background. And so then I was fortunate to meet with Jen and our other co-director, Camilla, and really said, hey, I want to work to tell our side of the story, and not just, hey, this is what happened with the staircase on our end, but really make it better for everyone else who is in documentaries.
Thanks for sharing that. My experience with this film, I won't be naming the film or the filmmaker, not for any specific reason other than the fact that I don't think it's helpful to focus on one person or one film, because it's a systemic problem and that we are all a part of. This was a film that we started filming in 2012. It was the first nonfiction film that I'd ever worked on, in that it was about my family, both my mom and my sister, who had moved to LA from Syria after the war, and the filmmaker was interested in making a film about. She had made a film about Syria in the past, and she was interested in making a film about kind of the effects of the war in Syria, but kind of locally here in LA. And so it was a big opportunity for me to be able to, get access to a filmmaker who has already done a feature film before and kind of understand the documentary field. And it was it was a masterclass for me, because I was able to go to things like, Film Week at what is now the Gotham. I was able to kind of meet with all these really big networks and understand film from that perspective, while also seeing kind of the effect that the film was having on my own family. And throughout the filmmaking process, but then also throughout the release. Very briefly, I think, in our experience, my sister was 13 when we started making the film, and she was a little bit, like a 13-year-old, kind of, I don't know, negative about everything, or just kind of whiny and doesn't really want to be part of the film. And I didn't take it seriously because she was whining about everything. And then my mom, who I think felt very seen by the film, and so that was different. But it was only kind of through the whole process of, making the film, having it be released, and then kind of seeing the effect a few years later that really I was able to understand what a film can do, for participants and how it can affect their lives. And it's a big effect on how I, make films right now.
Thank you. And Margie, can I ask you to unpack a little bit more about what actually happened around the filming? I mean, how were you alerted to the fact that a documentary was going to be made and that there was interest, and talk us through a little bit that experience as well?
It was a long time ago at this point, but I had come home from college for the summer, and my mother had passed away in 2001, and so that summer, my dad and my dad's lawyer just said, hey, this is going to be good for us and this will help your dad in his case. So, you know, get in front of the cameras and go do interviews. And I was not very excited about it. But of course I was going to do anything to help my dad. And then the filmmakers are lovely people, and they just kind of became a part of our family in a way that we were going through such traumatic experiences, and they were a smiling face in the courtroom. I remember Isabel, their cinematographer, was the only person as part of the press who would smile at me when things were going poorly. So our lives just kind of became intertwined with them, but at the same time, there was just an unease about personally being in front of the camera for so long, and then having, you know, kind of hiding from the world and not really talking about my experiences. And really, when I came to LA to work in film, I didn't tell any of my bosses or any of my coworkers, and just hope no one would watch it on the Sundance Channel. And then when Netflix came along, we weren't even told that it had been sold to Netflix until one of the editors tipped me off about it. And it was, and then the HBO Max series after that as well, we were not told about until it was too late. So my family really has had no agency this whole time, has really had no benefits from this, except for, you know, the benefits of getting my dad's story out there. And all of us are just trying to hide from the world right now. But I decided to not do that and dress in blue and come talk to people to try to make it better.
Thank you. I so appreciate that this is what you're doing right now. I guess I'd love to kind of drill into a couple of specifics to understand sort of what happened for you, and these are obviously somewhat biased in the way I'm framing them. But I'm curious, did either of you receive compensation in any way? Or was that an offer or a conversation that you had?
I was being compensated.
Oh, and I'm so sorry. We've now got folks coming in on the live stream. Sorry to cut you off, Mustafa. And so I can encourage, for the purposes of, I think, captioning, if people can use their names. And I also believe that we didn't introduce ourselves, including pronouns. So perhaps this is a moment to include pronouns for the first time. But each time you're speaking, participants, to remind everybody who you are for the purpose of those.
This is Mustafa, he or they. I was given compensation for my work as a co-producer on the film. I was paid hourly, but my family was not.
And Margie?
My family and I were not compensated at all for the staircase, but as a co-producer, we have received points on the back end for when we get distribution. And I'm Margie.
And what about the questions of sort of support or therapy? Were these questions that came up for either of you that were raised by the filmmakers during the filmmaking process or later? What do you imagine?
I'm Margie, and absolutely there was no talk of therapy or support during the staircase, but it was a top of mind discussion that we had, and we do have support, mental health support, through a participant advocate for subject.
Yeah, no, that was not something that was really talked about or mentioned. I mean, it wasn't really a part of the conversation at the time when we first started filming it in 2012, at least that I knew of. But yeah, so no, there was none of that.
And I'm curious, like, there's now been many years for both of you of like looking back at the film and the film process, and you've both clearly retained this strong relationship to filmmaking, one as a filmmaker and you're kind of as a co-producer. And so what are the lessons to be learned from this, do you feel, for the kind of wider filmmaking industry as a whole? Do you think anything of what you experienced could be avoidable, and if so, how? Margie?
I'm Margie, and I was actually just talking about this with Mustafa. I think one of the big things that documentary filmmakers don't understand is that open, honest communication goes so far. just cluing in your participants into, hey, things have changed. We actually think we want to go in this direction. Hey, we have distribution now. This is what this is going to look like. For my family, there were billboards in LA when the Netflix series came out, and I had to pass by one on my way to work, and no one warned me about it. And so the first time, I pull over to the side of the road and I'm shaking like a leaf. And so it's really, really important. We can talk about compensation, we can talk about mental health, we can talk about release forms and consent, and those are all vital, but it really starts with communication.
Mustafa?
Yeah, this is Mustafa. I would say that for me, well, I guess to talk about this, I need to share a little bit of kind of the issues that happened, which is for my sister, it's the fact that she didn't feel like she consented to the film because she was so young. And the kind of depiction that the film had of her, which is very positive and kind of by most accounts, everyone who watches the film falls in love with my sister and with my mom. But still, for my sister, it doesn't represent her in the way that she sees herself, and that she had no control over her image. I think that's especially as someone who is like a Gen Z / kind of young millennial, I think that's something that's really, really important for her to have kind of that control over her image. So I think for her, it's partially that, but then it's also the fact that anyone who looks up her name, the first thing that's going to be defining her is the film. And that, that was a snapshot of a certain time in her life in which she just came from Syria and she was trying to fit in. And so that's, that was how it was for my sister. For my mom, like I was saying before, my mom really felt validated by the camera being there and by, being able to tell her story. I think for my mom, it was more about the communication afterwards of the kind of after the ending of the filming, the relationship stopped with the filmmaker. And that for her felt really, didn't feel really good because she felt like she felt used, whether that's fair or not. That's how it felt on her end. And so I think, to address both of these things, I think having open and honest communication, for sure, I think is always important. I think being honest about as much as we can. I definitely didn't know kind of what the film was going to be like or how it was going to affect our family, anything at all. But I think being open and honest about where this could end up, how that could end up affecting kind of people's lives, and also, in terms of consent, as a filmmaker, I don't really like to get signed consent from my participants. I'm sure at some point my films are going to be somewhere where I'm going to need to get some kind of consent, but I'm very much willing to wait until the very last minute to actually get something signed, until after people really know what they're getting into. And I know that makes me a very risky investment in a marketplace. But this is something that for me is very important. Maybe there are other ways to doing it, and I'm very open to it, but I haven't figured out other ways to doing that. And the last thing I will say is, I think part of the problem is the fact that is formally in the way that we make documentaries, because after any screening, people come up to me and ask me about my mom and my sister as if they're best friends with them. And they feel like they know them very well. And that's what a lot of what we call good documentaries do, is kind of make you empathize with the character. But the problem is that they've only seen 75 minutes of their life. Literally 75 minutes of all their lives combined, which is over 75 years probably if you add it up all together, right? And so I think that's a very important thing, and I think it's on us as filmmakers to either, again, this has been my solution, is to either really lean into our subjectivity as filmmakers and make sure that we are actually, make it obvious for an audience that we are mediating. This is a mediated image, as we all know it is, and that we are not journalists by any stretch of the imagination. In my opinion, I don't know a single documentarian that kind of even does issue-driven docs that kind of hold themselves up to the kind of rigors of journalism or are backed by kind of the institutions that journalists are backed by. And so so that either we bring in our own subjectivity or we really bring in the participants themselves to be able to have more ownership of how, not necessarily putting the onus on them because they're not filmmakers, and that's also unfair sometimes to kind of put that on them, but to kind of really discover together of what this needs to be in a more collaborative way.
Thank you. I just want to pick up one last thing before we turn over to Jen and Eric to kind of hear more of a wide lens, which is, Margie, we heard a little from Mustafa around the idea of signing consent, whether it's a good thing or not, and what the experience was in that film. What was the experience for you, and do you feel like you fully were aware of the consequences of participating, and was there a signed form? Would a signed form have alleviated that for you?
Yes. For the original 8 episodes of The Staircase, my family did not sign release forms. It was poorly managed on the production side, unfortunately. And then we did sign release forms for the episodes 9 and 10, but not for the last 3. And it was shocking to me that Netflix was okay with that. But there's this idea of implied consent, so it's rather complicated. But I do think that signing the release form, and I signed an original release form when we started making Subject, and then our documentary Subject, and then we came back, and after we had been through so much together as filmmakers, and changed it, and gave points to the co-producers who were participants. And I had just gone through the HBO Max series about the staircase situation where we had never signed away our life rights, but somehow now it's a fictionalized series, and so we incorporated that into ours, that I still own my life rights for Subject.
And do you think that the release form would have addressed in any way? I guess what a question I'm curious about is something Mustafa was getting towards here, which is, what would it have meant for you to felt like you were agreeing fully to participate in this at the get-go? What happened versus what should have happened in your mind in terms of being like, I fully agree to this. I'm informed, I'm giving you this kind of in this free way.
I'm Margie, I keep on forgetting to do that. Margie, she, her. And I do think that if the filmmakers had sat down of The Staircase had sat down and said, hey, we just had a film that won an Oscar. We know what this process is like for our participants. We had a very young participant for our film that won an Oscar. These are his experiences. This is what you can expect with what we know now. I mean, Netflix wasn't a thing back then. So we had no idea what it would eventually become and where the story would go. But at the same time, just saying, hey, if this wins an Oscar, if this goes in the same direction that we've already seen, this is what you can expect. And this is what your life could look like moving forward, and what your children are going to see as well out in the world, and what search engines are going to show up for your names, and just sat us through and talked with us about that. I do think even with all of that, our dad was facing dire consequences, and so there was duress that was going on in the situation. So I think that a mental health facilitator should have been a part of that conversation as well.
And I just want to, throughout this conversation, keep us in mind both the legal framework, but then also the real human experience, and to understand those is really different, and that the legal experience or the legal tools should be serving, I think, the human experience to, or not perhaps be present at all. All right, let's turn over to Jennifer. I mean, you've now been exploring this through Subject. You've thought about this a lot. This here being how should we treat the participants of films? And so just talk us through where you've arrived. Do you feel there's a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to doing this? And if not, what might some of the considerations be towards a kind of fair and ethical filmmaking practice?
Sure. Absolutely not. No one
and
size
reminder,
fits.
sorry, name and pronouns.
Jen, she, her. So yes, absolutely not. No one size fits all at all. Subject was born out of at this point, like 15-year editing career, where I would find myself in these situations where I was making these big choices for people's lives that could ultimately affect their entire lives without even ever meeting them. Moreover, knowing their hopes and dreams for the film, what they want the film to represent. And it was something that was causing a lot of sleepless nights for me personally. I felt like I knew I wanted to do documentaries from the very beginning, and I was always doing other things where it didn't seem to have the ethical consequences when I was doing my documentary projects. And so, I met Camilla in 2017 at Tribeca, actually. And she had just left a journalism career and moved into documentary filmmaking and was like, this is insane. You guys have no rules at all. This is just like, you can just do whatever you want and no one cares. And I was like, no girl, it's insane. And so this was like a bottle of wine later and this conversation of like, what are we doing? And there's going to be this trail of dead bodies behind us if we're not careful, and that's really what we thought was at stake. And very serendipitously, Camilla got a call and was asked to meet with this girl, Margie Ratliff, who is interested in documentaries. And Camilla, I think it was right after Margie said I would never, ever be in a documentary ever again. She was like, oh, well, we're thinking about making this documentary. She's like, accept that one. So Margie was definitely part of the ethos and what we wanted to explore. She was instrumental in reaching out to our other participants, which included Jesse Friedman and his family from Capturing the Friedmans, Mukunda and his mother from the Wolfpack, Ahmed Hassan from The Square, and lastly, Arthur Agee and his family from Hoop Dreams. And so we spent 5 years with our participants. Now, Subject was an experiment, but it was its own thing, right? These are people who had already lived this experience, so they knew the process, they knew what they wanted to see differently. And so what we were able to do was start a little ahead of the game. There was things that they all brought to our attention that were extremely important to them. Like, I want to be aware of the distribution process, and where you think this might go, where you want it to go, and this is where I want it to go. I want to make sure that I see my sections and ultimately have agency over them. And that was easy because that's the story we were telling. Like, this doesn't work across the board. These are just two of the examples. And so when we rewrote the releases, we did it with them, ultimately made them co-producers, and it was a partnership. This, again, very specific to Subject. But what we've been able to take from Subject as we move into our next project, Camilla is directing a series for Sky in the UK, and I'm directing a series for HBO, is these ideas of amended releases, consent calendars, conversations that, bullet points of things that we kind of take for granted of knowing, and really finding allies in the industry that have the same vision, Eric being one of them. So really, our experiment has been really, it's been great. Lots of long conversations. This is a continuation, and we're just really happy to be here today.
Thank you. And so, talk us through in a little more detail, to the extent that you can, what you see as the components of kind of fairness. Like, do you want to start fleshing out for us, like from beginning to end, just surface, not comprehensively, that's too much to ask of one person, but just top of mind, so what might be the sorts of things one should be alert to beyond what you've already named in this practice, based off what you've really sort of seen as not happened to date?
So you mean for the participants, when I'm like approaching somebody? I really think that, you know, every project is totally different. The most important thing now that I think is to absolutely sit and not be telling the person the film that you want to make, but the film that they want to see made. And that's going to inform the film that you make completely. So, you know, they already know that I'm a documentary filmmaker. They already know that what I have access to, you know, whether it's obviously a very big deal or a very big difference if I'm coming to them with HBO's series versus an independent film that we want to make. So breaking down the differences between those in the process, those are two very different processes. Making sure that they're completely aware of where my power begins and where my power ends. And I would say the biggest thing that I've learned is this idea of a participant advocate. We didn't know we made her an executive producer on this film, Dr. Camilla Rashad. She is brilliant, she is incredible, but she's a trained therapist and was always there to make sure that, you know, I think we forget sometimes, if you make documentaries, you're an empath, you care, normally we get in this for the same reasons. And so we kind of forget that we're not lawyers, we're not doctors, we're not all these other things that we're expected to be through this process. And we also have our own families and our own lives, and it's a lot to put on somebody. So when you have that person kind of keeping you in check, and somebody who is a little bit outside of the film world, they can remind you of the things that, like, okay, well, have you talked that aftercare is huge, right? And then this idea of the film goes out into the world, you've been in these people's lives for 5 years, you're traveling, and then you go on to your next project. And there's this feeling of abandonment and this feeling of anger and confusion, and that can all be avoided, you know, with the right guidelines put in place. So one thing that we were really lucky to have was Dr. Cam writes everything down, everything's put into format, and so she was able to really condense things into, like, you know, the 3 C's or aftercare, and so she's kind of made a bit of a case study out of the film. We were also included in DOG's new framework, which I think is mandatory, and this beautiful resource. That's the thing, we haven't had resources for so long, and now we have all these emerging resources between DOG, which is a documentary accountability working group, also the DPA, who's bringing out you know, resources with regards to ethics and things like that. All these organizations that are allowing us to actually have places to go, have these conversations. And, you know, I'm going to bring this up, but Margie's been working on a nonprofit just for resources for participants where they can go and get legal advice or be put in touch with the right, you know, the right healthcare professional if they need it. So I think that, you know, those are just some of the ideas that, you know, that have been born out of this. And then the idea of a consent calendar was another really big one.
Beautiful. All right, let's turn over to you, Eric. Before I do, I just want to say I've now been given a tablet, so I'm aware of the chat that's happening virtually, and I encourage it to continue to happen. There will be time for Q&A at the end, and I will kind of try to dig into what's happening virtually as well, but I won't do a good job moderating the chat real time, so I leave you all to fend for yourselves in the online space till then. Eric, you know, we're talking a lot here about filmmakers, but when we're also talking about power and power imbalances, those with a lot of power, those with the economic power, what's the role, I guess, of those who are financing films, those who are buying them, the Netflix and others? You know, are there things, well, I guess I'm curious, just give us a bit of a landscape to begin with on what you see the state of play is currently around what those actors require or don't require, or the questions that they might ask around the role of participants in a film, broadly speaking. And then we can explore from there. Let's start where we're at.
Great. Eric, he, him. I'm probably the least qualified person in this panel to be discussing the ethics of the subject, to be, or rather, as a participant in this case. However, most of my experience sits at the intersection of transactions. So I've never made a documentary, I've never made a film, never been a participant in a film, but I sell a lot of films and have sort of been on the front lines of how large media organizations, increasingly fewer large media organizations, are making decisions about how they want to finance and assess liability for the projects that are now making them, as we've all seen, lots and lots of money. There is, I will say, I think, a general understanding amongst all of the people who are financing movies that subjects in many cases are subject to exploitation. And more than that, I think that most of our community of we'll call them buyers and financiers are on the side of finding practical ways for subjects to not only be treated with more fairness, but in ways that are appropriate, I would say compensated and supported throughout the entire process. So generally, I would say that the industry wants to address these things. I think that more than anything, it's a sort of putting our head in the sand about talking about it publicly for the most part. So what I hope actually comes of this panel and these conversations and this film is that we can bring the other side of this conversation into the conversation, and that's really lawyers and business affairs executives and corporate media executives who control lots of the kind of the money for these projects, so that we can kind of have both sides of this conversation present to create a framework for addressing an issue that is making some people lots of money and most people no money at all. So I think that's sort of the place to start. I will say that the question of compensation for subjects, which is really where I think most of my experience has come in. I think most people here are filmmakers or producers. I think that most folks have realized that many participants and subjects, even in most cases, are being compensated. They're just done so in a way that is sort of hidden in the budget and not acknowledged to film financiers and to platforms and distributors, because that presents a form of, I guess it's this back to this journalism or entertainment spectrum. It sort of conflicts with the idea that this is an objective piece of journalism, right? And it's really ultimately about kind of a corporate liability to that in that regard. But the ways that we've been doing it are through licensed materials, so paying for somebody for goods, not services in this case. So if there's an archive or some kind of music or some kind of contribution to the production, in many ways, in many cases, I think in these documentaries, made of home videos, right, there is a license being paid. So instead of a fee for participation in a documentary, you pay for the goods that they're handing over to that documentary. It's really a way to compensate somebody for their participation, their contribution. It's just written into the document as something completely different so that we can continue to kind of cover our eyes about how the practice is actually happening. I think in a lot of cases, participants are afforded back end. Sometimes it's hidden in the form of gifts and not, they're subject to side letters instead of being written to the waterfall, sharing with the producers. This is practically, I guess, the same scenario in which you could be compensated for any kind of upside that the film receives. But again, it's back to the same problem of just not really, there's no willingness to acknowledge that we need to start addressing these problems, right? So it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind thing for these giant corporations. I assume it's also an insurance concern as well. The question of consent forms, I mean, I think you brought it up, Margie. You're right, I'm only an amateur attorney, so don't take my word on this, but implied consent gives pretty broad leeway to, if you sit for enough interviews, you are implying consent and participation in a project. So there's not really a great legal recourse for trying to protect participants and understand fully consent. The law can't cut it up finely enough for us to use that as a kind of primary resource. I will say that, and this is sort of, I think, my role on the panel, incredibly important to have, as Mustafa, I'm sure knows, these signed consent forms, because it is what allows you to participate in a market. And it is, at the moment, sort of the only tool for a financier to measure liability. So finding better ways to address that, I think, are incredibly important. It's never going to be essentially the thing that allows for consent to be given, I don't think. I don't think it's the solution practically for us to continue this as a market practice. It's a requirement.
And just for a kind of clarifying for those who are not in the know about what happens when a film is being bought, what are the questions, if any, that are asked around consent in that moment? Is it just, are there release forms? Is that question even asked? Or is there a wider question that tends to be asked at the moment in terms of practice?
I think we're in the middle of a shift of that pretty dramatically. This is a pretty intensive discussion in our documentary community, which is, I would say, actually more reflexive than most entertainment and media communities. But it's consent forms. It's part of a chain of title, and that is the limit of that conversation. And it's a consent form without the ability to stop the release of the film. It has to be limited to punitive damages, not stop the release. So that's it.
That's it.
Yeah.
So you raised something here, which is some transparency. A lot of what's going on is not in the public eye. I'm curious to hear, like, first from those who are being participants in films, whether you think that we should be moving to a norm in which there's more disclosure in a film about some of these issues. About, there is not standard practice, for example, when the credits roll, for there to be transparency around who was paid, whether a participant was paid to be in the film, whether they were given any editorial control or not. Frankly, the term co-producer, what the hell does that mean? It's wonderful that it's included there, but does it mean that you got editorial control? Does it mean you got paid? These are all opaque terms. And so I'm curious, is at the very least what we should be marching towards an expectation of more full disclosure in the films themselves for the wider public, not just us in the know, about what happened? And how much would that feel like it solves some of the issues you all are struggling with now? Let's hear first from you, Margie, and then Mustafa.
Margie, she, her. I think it's the baseline. I think that on a base level, there should be transparency about not just consent forms, but also, compensation. The more that filmmakers talk about how the ways in which they compensated their participants, the more that it normalizes it, and the more that it will be able to be an industry-wide conversation. And those are the kinds of issues that need to be spoken about very openly in the sales and distribution conversations. So I'd like to work towards that. I do think offering support, mental health support, and other, communication for the participants is also, the next level of how do we take care of everyone.
Mustafa?
That's a hard question for me, because I think in general transparency is good. I think having the audience understand what it is that they're watching and what were the kind of power dynamics that were involved in whatever they're watching, I think is important. I think if we are living in this nonfiction sphere, I think regardless of how much fictionalizing we do, how much reenactments we do, how hybrid it is, if we are claiming to be part of this kind of documentary sphere, I think it is very important that the audience understands the frame. And I think part of that can be in the credits, or can be in the film itself, and I think it can include who's compensated, whether also, I think there's the issue of life rights, there's the issue of paying participants for access, which is a whole other thing than actually compensating participants. I've known filmmakers that will pay, whatever, just so they can have exclusive, access to this participant, they will pay a ton of money. And I think there's a lot of ethical issues with that as well, because it goes back to this thing that you're talking about with this obsession that we are seen as objective and that our films are seen objective. And it's this power that we have as documentary filmmakers, is that we can say we're a fly on the wall or we're just there and this is just the truth. And it's in that objective gaze, I think, is a really big, for me, a really big problem. Even as the audience is more and more aware of kind of how reality TV works and how documentary is still understanding how reality TV works, still documentary has this understanding of it being this kind of objective thing, and especially when we have things like true crime, documentaries that really, are built in a lot of ways on life rights, on paying for access or not, and just using your story, but the marketplace itself also has to kind of open itself up to, like you're saying that the industry wants to deal with it. It's hard for me to believe, because the whole industry is based on these stories of individuals that are told this kind of gossip, like paparazzi type, like gossiping about people to other people. And that's kind of how we sell documentaries. So I don't know if the industry really wants to. This is not directed towards you, but I guess I'm curious to hear from you about when you say like the industry's wanting to deal with it. Like, what does that really mean? Because it really actually, I think, can mean really big things to the pockets of a lot of the people who are funding these films. To be able to actually have that honest, a conversation, have the audience really know what actually they're getting.
Want to defend yourself, Eric? Or industry writ large?
Eric, here to defend myself. Let me be more specific. I think that the creative executives and commissioning executives, for the most part, would like to be on the side of the good and create solutions for, because everybody knows that this is happening, create solutions that are creating a more ethical industry. I believe that to be true. I think that even potentially the attorneys who are doing these deals and managing the liability of these giant corporations would like to be on the same side, but the corporation sort of has a voice of its own and speaks for itself. So I think that if not forced or compelled to enter that conversation and make a change, there is a benefit to them to, in some ways, to, at least in the short term, to remain opaque about how it's working, because to start talking about compensation of participants also requires to start talking about compensation of filmmakers and the price of some of these transactions and the numbers of people who may be watching these films on these platforms, all of which have been kept in a black box for a very long time. So it's sort of a slippery slope, and I think that that's the tension. It's not for, I think, lack of desire to be creating a more ethical way to create these films, though. I do think that that belief is there generally.
Jennifer, can we hear from you in terms of, what do you think industry actually adopting good practice looks like? Moving away from the filmmaker per se, but thinking about some of these bigger economic actors. I mean, there's just something they should be doing right now to be stepping up to the plate. And where are the pressure points that you see in terms of change there?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things that Eric just mentioned when we were making Subject, it was quite alarming to see that we could find no statistics on who was watching what and how many people were watching the content that we were making. I think that, we as filmmakers tend to really try to keep our budgets down, and the headspace I was in for so long was like, the cheaper I could keep it, and I was proud of that. But what I was doing was not paying myself or my producer, also, like directing, but also editing and all these other things that were just not sustainable as a filmmaker. And so that, really more transparencies from these big corporations. Eric's absolutely right. That does become a slippery slope because then, they see our budgets and, then it just becomes a very slippery slope. I mean, are you talking about just like the entire industry, or like it's a filmmaker in particular?
I mean, I guess I'm talking about, yes, I am talking about the entire industry. I feel like naming where you think, who do you think needs to start changing their behavior? We've talked a lot about filmmakers. What about buyers? What about those who are financing? And how? Like, what are we asking?
Well, I hate to say it, but like, I have to give props to social media. I mean, honestly, like, there's nothing worse than like it scares the hell out of them, and that's one thing that I've been able to take to like the bigger corporations and be like, look, do you guys want to be on the wrong side of this? You're putting all this money and this effort into this project just for the participants to turn around and be like, I was mistreated. This wasn't my story. I didn't consent to this. This is ugly. I mean, some are, if you have that mentality that they're a little too big to fail. So, I feel like every week there's a certain, outcry from a certain streamer, and that doesn't seem to be changing much. But I do think that, in my experience, I have to agree with Eric that people do want to be on the right side, and they want to, I think when you come to them, they're normally pretty reasonable. I'm like, hey, I'm doing this series about sex abuse survivors. I need a therapist. Let's get that in the, I need that as a line item. And I was met with a resounding yes. When I came to them and said, hey, I want to implement this consent calendar. These are survivors that are coming out of an entire lifetime of manipulation, lies, coercion. I need to be able to not put this in front of them right away. It was a yes. So I do think that, as we have more language, more proof, more resources, I think it's going to be met with open arms by a lot of the creatives that want to see the same things and got into the industry for the same reasons we did. Now, that is not going to go across the board. Our lawyer, I think his stomach drops every time we call him at this point, because it's like, oh God, what do you guys want to do now? But what we're able to do is have new documents moving forward. And it's just, and I'm only talking about, that's another thing that I think we should really make clear. Like, this doesn't work across the board. You're doing a film where you're investigating these oil tycoons that poured all their oil into a marsh where children play. You're not going to be like, hey, let's be partners on this, and will you sign it? And let me show you the film before it comes. That's a completely different, and that's still documentary, right? So that's another big thing. We have this one overarching term, documentary, and there's so many subgenres in that genre, and there can't be the same rules across the board. What we're talking about is an imbalance in power dynamics that we need to recognize, and when we're entering into a partnership, and as you all know, most of the time, a very long partnership where there has to be this basis of trust, and that needs to continue in every step of the process. Subject's been amazing, because as we go in, we pitch our new projects, we've been asked this twice, can we show the company your film so they know what they're getting into? And we're like, yes. But even the process of making Subject, the workshop process, it took, not just with the co-producers and the experts, but the original directors, that was a year-long process that now we know the time that we need to set aside for that. So I think it's just a lot of talking. Really, that's the bottom line. A lot of talking, a lot of discussing, and joining together as we move forward to figure out a better way to do things.
Thank you. Well, let's maybe open this up to some questions in the audience. And while people are preparing their questions, I know there will be some, and you won't leave us hanging. Let me find one that I was able to get from the chat, and I apologize. I'm really struggling to scroll here. So people who put their questions or chats in most recently are getting a massive benefit. I apologize. Feel free to copy and paste if you want me to see it. Here is one. And maybe this question would be well placed for Mustafa, although feel free anybody else to comment. The question goes, I am giving my participants the option to opt out of the film through rough cut. They are very vulnerable and poor, however. But it would seem like a payment to them would have a coercive effect, whether disguised as archival licensing or not. How to balance the desire to be equitable with the desire not to influence them going public with this story? I think there's an interesting, bigger question to be asked here, Mustafa, about how does one navigate, like how does one weigh competing interests in these sorts of, in these instances? This is one specific example, but we can all have, I think, examples in our mind of these different considerations and what ethics might look like and look different in the context.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, it's very hard for me, not that I am any authority on anything, but it's very hard for me to even engage with that question fully without knowing a lot more specifics about what the situation is. But the kind of questions that come to my mind are, I think that's a great point about like paying them is also to coerce them in some way. And I think that also is not necessarily, that also can go against consent. And so it is a complex thing that we need to engage with. Some of the question that in general, the question I have for as a field is like, why are we so obsessed with stories about underprivileged people and stories about trauma and misery that also put ourselves in these very, very ethically kind of murky places also? Including myself. I'm making, one documentary that's also with a mixed status Mexican American family where the parents are undocumented. So I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, but I think with the thing that I would think about is like, well, why are you making this documentary? What is it actually really about for you? And how can you actually include the participants in the process in the making of it in a way that feels like it's beyond just like, do I pay them or do I not? That it is actually a lot bigger conversation about the form of the documentary, about also, again, depending on where it's going to be, it's like, can you afford to actually keep it until after Rough Cut? Because Rough Cut doesn't tell you anything. The things that happened with my mom and my sister, they would have known nothing. They did see Rough Cuts, and they were fine. My sister was like covering her face the whole time because she didn't like to see herself on the TV, which like none of us do, but my mom did. But beyond that, you don't know how this is going to change your life. So I would say like that's really unfair to kind of put on them like you have until Rough Cut and that's it. Also, again, have you had conversations with them about where this is going to be and how this could affect them? I think there's a lot that needs to be kind of sorted through there.
Any other thoughts from folks, or should we turn to the audience? Yeah, Eric.
This is Eric. I think one thing that we haven't really discussed all that directly is stipends, I think, for subjects, something that I don't actually know that much about, though I know many of my clients will compensate in like a small c the subjects for participating in a day's worth of work because it does take them away from the other things that they're doing. And I think that's one potentially small way to start to address these things, because you're right. We're making films about precarious people very often, and I think finding ways to make up for the lost in opportunity otherwise, even if it's not a big lump sum transaction, is some effect. And I don't think there's going to be adverse effects for that legally in most cases that I can think of.
To the audience, do we have audience questions? I see a hand up. I'm not sure how is there a mic runner? There is.
I have one. Hi. Hi.
I can't really see. Apologies. Great. Speak to us. You're a kind of black void.
Hi, my name is Kwebe Koti. I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much. I'm an IDA grantee, so I'm excited. I'm on my first feature documentary. And I was curious, like the conversation that you're having about compensation. I'm making a documentary in a developing country. And as we get more grants and our budget starts raising, we are a little bit hesitant. I guess I'm the producer of the project. We've been a little bit hesitant to discuss the budget with our subjects and like the people that the story that we're telling. So I guess my question is, when you start talking about consent and being open and clear, like, would you recommend talking about the budgets that we're, and the grants that we're getting and how now our budget is like, $400,000, and $400,000 to the community that we're documenting is like a large amount. So first, I didn't think about the conversation that you're talking about compensating. So that's one thing that we will start discussing. But like, do you also discuss your budget and once your subjects start realizing that outside of their world, there's all this money coming in for the project. Like, how do you, what do you do? Like, what would you recommend? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone want to offer an answer to that?
Sure.
This is Jennifer.
Yeah, this is Jennifer. Budgets are a really tricky thing. The ebb and flow of them. What you could show them tomorrow could be completely different. A year from now, it will be completely different from a year from now, and it will be completely different from a year beyond that, and it will change again when you sell the film. I think for me personally, what's really important is, there's two. I've seen other filmmakers who I adore, like what they do is they set aside part of the line item when the money is raised, that their community will be getting this much money in the form of there's some sort of foundation or NGO that supports that community. So it goes to an entire community and not just one person, because that gets really tricky. I know that co-producer can be really ambiguous, but that was the quickest way that we could be like, these guys were involved in a way that wasn't just this they were involved, like I said, the ethos of the film, creating the film, what the film was. That looked at, and then in addition to that, we accredited them for the roles that they played. We paid them for those roles, because if Ahmed was going to shoot in Istanbul with us or in Egypt, like, we're going to pay him as a DP. And then when we're spending the week with them on the road, in those roles, we paid them as a co-producer. If they're going to be in Tribeca for a week and speak on behalf of the film, we're going to pay them in that capacity. So I think it's also really about defining roles. I don't think that it would make sense to, hand out a budget this early to an entire community. I think that would be very problematic because, again, it's this like ever morphing thing, but being very upfront about, if we raise this much, we can guarantee this much back to the community is, I think, that's what I would hope for.
Thank you. Time for one more question from the audience.
Yes, good morning. My name is Rodrigo Dorschman, he, him, and I'm an IDA fellow today and forever. Roll. So I'm in the middle of a large project, and I also believe I wait to the last possible minute to ask for release forms, and also I deal with Latinos and undocumented communities and Spanish wording, and you show them 3 pages and it's over. And I try to do work for PBS, and one of my participants said, well, what about the material? Right? You make the film, 90 minutes, a series, but there's like hundreds of hours of my life in the kitchen, talking, doing things, saying things. And this is an upcoming politician, one of the first Afro-Latino politicians in Georgia. And so I'm like, oh, yes, well, what about the material? And yes, and who has control over that? And how can I guarantee that that's going to be used in a different way by someone else? And so I'm looking at the release forms from PBS and ITDS, et cetera, and that question is not addressed. And so I had to negotiate back and forth, and I don't have money for a lawyer right now, to figure out a language that I think is fair. And so we came up with this document, and it might not pass muster. I may have lawyers saying, you know what, nope, you don't get funding for this, we can't insure you. But you talk about community-centered practices, non-extractive practices, and yet the system is not willing to change its legal language. So one thing is to speak it, the other thing is to walk the walk. And I think it's time for that conversation, because the material, who owns, it's my story, he said, she said. So I think, I'm just wondering what your thoughts about this very important unspoken part of like who owns not just the story, but the actual material.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Who owns material?
Generally the financier. It's somewhat complicated because there's a difference between owning a copyright and having a perpetual license to the copyright, which are not, it's a distinction without a difference for usage in this case. But the footage, whether it ends up in the film or not, is generally owned by the financier or a combination of the financier and the filmmaker. There is a limitation on usage, however, for the distributor and how they will be able to use the footage you provided them. So they're not going to be able to use footage that was not in the film without your express permission, for example. So you should have the limit, like the ability to limit what is used and what is not used. It would be atypical, but I don't know. It would probably be pretty tricky to have a participant own I would say near impossible to have a participant own the footage and have it also be financed by public broadcast in particular, but obviously of course, I would definitely consult a lawyer. But yes, the money owns the stuff. That's almost always what ends up happening, or some version of that.
Yeah, I will say, and HBO is going to kill me, but we did an amendment. We did a various amendment that when Eric's right, there was a line saying that it was restricted to what was in the film, but a lot of my participants were very nervous and they didn't know if they wanted to be anonymous or not. So I shot it both ways. And in that amendment, there was also that we would decide right before the editing process. I would revisit, we'd make that decision together. And then beyond that, if they decided not to be in it or be anonymous, that all their footage that was not used in the program would be deleted. And so they agreed. So we have 4 participants out of the 16 that everything that includes their face only, will be deleted.
I think that's not wild, by the way. I think that's something that could be, so long as you provide enough additional footage for the purposes of marketing, which is all approved, I think that deleting that extra footage is something that could pass muster with most of these organizations. I don't see because if you can't use it, there's no need to keep it in their eyes. They're transactional.
And I also know that PBS is doing a really big revamp as well, so I think that they would probably be open to these conversations.
We're almost out of time, but there was one specific question that seems to be incredibly useful for everybody to know, which was, if we want to prepare our protagonists in the ways that Margie described, what resources exist for them, not just for the filmmakers, but for participants? Is it watching subject is the question, or are there books, are there recordings, are there other frameworks that exist that we could turn to beyond our own knowledge and I guess the encouragement we've all been given now of like talking with our participants through this process? Maybe Jennifer, Margie, the two of you?
I think Margie's awesome to answer this.
Margie, she, her. Well, the reason that some of the co-producers of Subject and I are starting a nonprofit for this is because it is this empty space of, we have Dog that has done an amazing release for their accountability framework, and you can bring your participants to that and say, hey, this is what the framework that I'm working on, or these are the ways that I want to move through this process. But our nonprofit specifically will be a resource for participants and advocate for them on their side.
Fantastic. So watch this space. I believe the nonprofit is not yet formed, but it is.
Yes, we're coming up with a name. So if anyone has a good idea, let me know.
All right, we're really at the top of the hour, obviously, or the hour and 15 minutes, I should say. So we can't get through everything now. I am thrilled, however, to say that at 1:45, I believe today, there is a breakout conversation around participants. So I think this conversation can continue. So please, other questions that couldn't get asked, I think you can probably take them to that forum. I think it's pretty difficult to summarize what was said here. I think maybe some of the key themes that were brought out, though, were, look, we just need a greater practice, a greater muscle around, as filmmakers, as industry, around centering the participant or the subject's experience. It's often not something that's front of mind for a lot of us, and that needs to happen throughout the stages of the documentary. It seems to be something that surfaced from inception to release and then beyond, this idea of constant communication. It seems to have heard as well that this is very contextual. This is not a checklist exercise. Ethics never can be. It's going to really depend on the nature of your film. We didn't really have time to spell out all of the specifics about how you might, and nor could you, when compensation is actually appropriate and how, and the various other constraints. But instead, one just needs to be incredibly thoughtful about that and draw on the increasing number of resources that we've had named here that are coming to the light. And to name those again, it was the DPA and the Documentary Accountability Working Group producing guidelines, and now we're seeing also sort of Margie's group's going to put things out there. And then I think also being alert to the fact that documentary is a mess, and I think we can have a spectrum. We can have those documentaries that on the one hand are extractive. They are, maybe they shouldn't be, but that's the nature of them. Right through to those documentaries that are in fact perhaps more transformational, they're co-collaborative. And in that sense, maybe when you're operating at that end of the spectrum, you're really thinking about your participants and your subjects as almost co-creators, right through to those in which you're clearly a subject and someone that's quite being othered. And sometimes it's appropriate to be at different places on that spectrum. And sometimes, we're really aiming towards to be at that more kind of transformational or restorative part of things. And I think the last thing I'd say is that almost everybody did seem to agree that getting motion on this is going to require more transparent conversation, more transparent conversation, and then more transparency about the decisions we make as filmmakers and within the industry, and for this conversation to get into the forelight. I probably muddled all of that, and therefore I invite the participants to kind of give just their last closing thoughts rather than me. We can go down from Margie onwards. I'd really just love to hear sort of 2 sentences from you in terms of, ideally where you think change and the practice needs to go, but if you'd prefer to put your sentences to other use, you are free to.
Margie, she, her. I think just all of us being in this room right now, willing to listen and willing to have thoughtful questions and mull it over when you leave this room is the first step. I've traveled a lot since releasing a subject, and people are eager to talk about these things. They have lots of complicated questions, and there are more resources now to help answer those questions.
Mustafa, I will take this opportunity to call out something that we didn't get a chance to really talk so much about, which is which films get funded and distributed. And I think this is a really, really big problem, actually, maybe, in some way more important than everything we talked about, because we all want to work in a sustainable way, and we all know what films get funded and what don't, what forms get funded and what don't. And I think this is directed directly at distributors and funders. What will you fund? What stories? Does it have to be stories about trauma? Does it have to be stories that are extremely, objective kind of, and that way can they be more opaque? Is there more place for experimentation? I'm looking at PBS also in the room, that is very conservative in this way. And so that's the conversation that I would also love to kind of continue having forward.
Yeah.
That was good. I also want to do another little call out to DART. If you guys, speaking of trauma, they're another amazing resource that I've had. Bruce Shapiro, the pleasure of working with, and have a lot of great information to offer. And I guess the big takeaway I would just say is this is so imperfect, and it will continue to be. And I think that's what we all need to remember. That there's going to be so many subjects was born out of mistakes. Everything has come out of mistakes, and I still continue to make a lot of mistakes. So I think that, building off those and learning from them will just help, minimize those dead bodies behind us. So.
How to follow that? I think Eric, excuse me. I think my call or other request is for the money to join this conversation. I think in particular, streaming platforms who are making most of the decisions, or rather making markets for the stuff that we're making for the most part, join these conversations, because that's the other half of this that isn't present and is absolutely required to make any kind of headway into this conversation.
So more careful, thoughtful, ethical films from all of us soon. Take care, everybody, and